The gavel cracked like a rifle shot, silencing the murmurs of the packed HOA boardroom. The sound echoed off the cheap wood paneling, a cheap imitation of real power. Brenda Hopewell, her helmet of frosty blonde hair unmoving, didn't even look at me as she read the verdict. Her voice was a monotone of feigned regret, a weapon she'd honed over a decade of presiding over this little fiefdom. Therefore, due to repeated and flagrant violations of the Lake Serenity Protective Covenant, Article 7, Section 4, the board has voted unanimously to initiate lien proceedings and authorize the immediate impound and disposal of the structure. The structure was my father's 1972 Boston whaler. His ashes were scattered on Lake Serenity from its bow. Two men in generic security uniforms shifted behind me. I could smell their cheap polyester blends and the faint, stale odor of cigarette smoke clinging to one of them. My own heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum beat against the cold, deliberate tick of the antique clock on the wall behind Brenda. This couldn't be happening. Not over a boat cover. Not like this. But this story doesn't start with a gavel. It starts with the smell of pine needles and gasoline 2 days earlier. The morning had been perfect. A low mist clung to the glassy surface of Lake Serenity, and the air carried the crisp, clean scent of North Carolina mountain water and sun-warmed cedar. I was down at my dock, a crescent of weathered gray planks that was the sole reason I'd bought the property. The 72 whaler, the Second Wind, was tied up, her vintage Evan Rood outboard quiet for the moment. I was wiping her down, the familiar feel of the sun-bleached teak under my palm a daily meditation. My dog, a grizzled coonhound named Judge, snored loudly from a pile of life jackets. I'd moved to Lake Serenity 6 months ago after 20 years as an Army JAG lawyer. I'd traded court-martials for crappy fishing, legal briefs for the brief, perfect silence of a sunrise on the water. This dock, this boat, this view, it was the peace I'd been fighting for. The peace was shattered by the sound of an overtuned V8 engine and the crunch of gravel under aggressive tires. A silver Lincoln Navigator, so clean it looked like it had been rolled out of a showroom that morning, pulled to a stop at the edge of my property. Not on the road. On my grass, the door opened and Brenda Hopewell emerged. She was 55, dressed in athleisure wear that had never seen a drop of sweat, her posture rigid. She carried a leather-bound clipboard like a scepter. Her eyes, the color of faded denim, scanned my dock, my boat, my shed, missing nothing. Judge lifted his head, let out a low woof, and went back to sleep. He knew a lost cause when he saw one. "Mr. Crocker," she said, her voice carrying across the lawn without needing to rise. "It was a talent. Lovely morning." "It was, Brenda," I said, not stopping my work. "In the military, you learn to identify a person's power center immediately." Hers was an unshakable belief in her own authority, a authority granted by a 50-page document she interpreted like a holy text. "What can I do for you?" She didn't walk down to the dock. She waited for me to come to her, a queen summoning a subject. I stayed where I was. A tiny muscle in her jaw twitched. She glanced at her clipboard. "It has come to the board's attention that your boat cover is non-compliant." I looked at the Second Wind. The cover was a heavy-duty blue tarp, tied down securely with bungee cords. It was functional. It kept the rain and pine needles out. "How so?" "Protective Covenant, Article 4, Section 12, she recited, not needing to look. "All boats docked or stored on lot-adjacent property must be covered with a manufacturer-approved, color-coordinated marine cover." "That," she gestured with her pen, a look of mild distaste on her face, as if she'd found a hair in her salad, "is a tarp. It's an eyesore. It detracts from the community's aesthetic uniformity." I leaned against the whaler's console. The morning sun felt good on my back. "Brenda, this is a 40-year-old boat. The manufacturer-approved cover rotted away during the Clinton administration. This eyesore keeps my bilge dry." "The rules are the rules, Mr. Crocker. We all sacrifice a little personal preference for the greater good of property values." She offered a thin, bloodless smile. "Consider this a friendly warning. A compliant cover, navy blue or forest green to match community standards, must be installed by 5 p.m. tomorrow, or a fine will be levied." She turned and walked back to her Lincoln, her shoes leaving perfect impressions in the dewy grass. She didn't look back. The Navigator executed a precise 3-point turn and purred away. I looked at Judge. "What do you think? A little too non-compliant for her tastes?" Judge farted in his sleep. Seemed about right. I thought that was the end of it. A petty power play, a shot across the bow to remind the new guy who was in charge. I was wrong. It was just the first move. The next morning, I was in town at Mountain Marine, buying a criminally overpriced navy blue boat cover. The bell on the door jingled, and the owner, a man named Ray with forearms like smoked hams and a kind face, shook his head as he rang me up. "Let me guess," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Brenda's seasonal aesthetic committee paid you a visit." "You could say that. She's the reason I keep these things in stock." He bagged the cover. "Word of advice? Don't give her an inch. She's not just the HOA president. Her husband, Frank, he's the county building inspector. Her brother's on the sheriff's advisory council. It's a whole ecosystem around here. People cross her. Suddenly their septic system's not up to code or their dock permit gets lost." He handed me the bag. Good luck. I drove home, a low hum of unease in my gut. It wasn't about a boat cover anymore. It was about the architecture of power in a small town. I'd seen it before, in corrupt supply sergeants and officers who thought their rank made them kings. It always started with something small, something petty. I got back to find a second notice nailed to my front door. This one was about the unapproved, non-native azalea bushes my grandmother had planted 40 years ago. The paper was thick, official. The sharp, clean smell of the fresh ink was a stark contrast to the weathered wood of my doorframe. That's when I saw it. Down at the community dock, 100 yards from my property, Brenda was overseeing the launch of a boat. But this wasn't any boat. It was a behemoth, a 40-foot luxury pontoon boat, all gleaming white fiberglass and polished chrome. It had a wet bar, a sound system, a towering bimini top. It was named the Rule Breaker. The irony was so thick you could taste it, like copper on the tongue, but that wasn't what caught my eye. It was the trailer. The pontoon boat was massive, a floating condo. The trailer hauling it was a dual-axle beast, but it was hitched to Brenda's Lincoln Navigator. I'm no mechanic, but even I know a Nissan Altima isn't towing a semi-truck. The math was all wrong. The Navigator's tow capacity was what, 9,000 pounds max. That pontoon, fully loaded with fuel and furniture, had to be pushing 15,000. The SUV's rear suspension was squatted down so far the wheel wells were eating the tires. It was a lawsuit on wheels. She'd violated her own covenant's rules on vehicle parking on the street during launch, but that was the least of it. She was creating a massive safety hazard. I pulled out my phone and took a few pictures. Just for my own records. A JAG lawyer always documents everything. It's a habit you don't break. I spent the afternoon installing the new, compliant navy blue boat cover. It fit like a glove and looked frankly ridiculous on the old whaler, like putting a tuxedo on a fisherman. Judge watched me, his head cocked. At 4:45 p.m., 20 minutes before her deadline, Brenda's Navigator rolled up again. She didn't get out this time. She just lowered the window, gave the new cover a long, appraising look, and gave me a slow, satisfied nod, like a warden acknowledging a prisoner's obedience. Then she drove off. I thought I'd passed the test. I was wrong. I'd just shown her I could be pushed. The knock came at 8 the next morning. It was the county sheriff's deputy, a young guy who looked embarrassed to be there. He held out a formal notice. "Sorry to bother you, Mr. Crocker. Nuisance complaint." Nuisance? Unpermitted structure on the dock. The boat shed. He pointed to the old, open-sided lean-to at the end of my dock where I stored life jackets, oars, and fishing gear. It had been there since the Nixon administration. The wood was silvered with age, and it smelled of damp rope and nostalgia. "It's been there for 50 years, I said, my voice tight. "Complainant says it's a new installation, says it violates setback rules from the waterline. I gotta write it up. You'll have to go before the zoning board." He couldn't meet my eyes. Complainant is a Mrs. Hopewell. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was inventing them. She'd seen me document her violation, and this was her counterstrike. This was escalation. I went down to the dock, my blood running hot. I needed to cool off. I needed to think. I decided to take the second wind out for a run. I pulled off the new, compliant cover, tossing it onto the dock. The engine coughed to life on the second pull, the smell of two-stroke oil mixing with the lake air. I idled out of the cove, the wake from the whaler slapping softly against the shore. I opened her up on the main channel, the wind whipping through my hair, the roar of the engine drowning out my furious thoughts. I was gone for maybe an hour. When I returned, I cut the engine and drifted the last 100 feet to my dock. The silence felt heavy. Wrong. Judge was standing at the end of the dock, whining. The new, compliant, navy blue boat cover was gone. So was the second wind. The dock was empty. The tie-up lines lay coiled and limp in the water like dead snakes. All that was left was the faint smell of diesel exhaust hanging in the air, a different, dirtier smell than my old Evinrude made, and nailed to one of the posts of my unpermitted lean-to was a fresh notice from the Lake Serenity HOA violation. Article 7, Section 4, storage of derelict, unseaworthy, or unsightly vessels on community property is strictly prohibited. The cited vessel has been impounded for disposal. All impound fees and fines must be paid prior to any appeal. My boat. My father's boat. She'd stolen it. The paper crumpled in my fist. The world narrowed to the empty space of water where the second wind should have been. The injustice of it was a physical pain, a cold knot in my stomach. This wasn't about rules. This was a tantrum. A show of force from a woman who couldn't stand to be challenged, but Brenda Hopewell had made a fatal mistake, the same one every petty tyrant makes. She'd assumed her opponent was powerless. She'd assumed I was just another civilian she could bully. She had no idea who she was really dealing with. She had no idea that my 20 years in the JAG Corps weren't just about courtrooms. They were about investigations. They were about following the money, tracing the lies, and building a case so airtight it leaves no room for escape. I looked at the notice in my hand, then out at the water where her obscenely large pontoon boat, the Rule Breaker, was now moored. The math of the trailer, the SUV, the sheer weight of it. A slow, cold smile touched my lips. The fight was on, and she'd just given me my first weapon. Where are you watching from? Comment your city right now, because this HOA takedown is just getting started, and you're not going to believe where it leads. The scent of rain on hot asphalt hung in the air, a promise of the summer storm brewing over the mountains. But the real storm was brewing inside my home office. The walls, once bare, were now a mosaic of desperation and corruption. Printed emails, property records, grainy photos from long-lost county archives, and a spiderweb of red string connected it all. In the center was a blown-up satellite image of the lake, with a crimson circle around Brenda Hopewell's dock and the words, "The Rule Breaker," scrawled beneath it. For 72 hours, I'd lived on cold coffee and a cold fury. Sleep was a forgotten concept. Judge whined at my feet, concerned by the change in routine, his doggy brain unable to process the legal war room his home had become. The hum of my computer and the occasional rustle of paper were the only sounds, a stark contrast to the laughter and boat engines out on the water. My peace had been stolen, and in its place was a mission. It started with the boat. Brenda's notice had said impounded for disposal, but Ray from Mountain Marine had confirmed there wasn't a single impound lot within 50 miles that handled boats. The county sheriff's office? They didn't have the facility. So where did she take it? I'd driven every back road around Lake Serenity, my eyes scanning for the familiar shape of the second wind. I found nothing. Then, on a hunch, I'd parked down the road from Brenda's own property, a massive lakefront compound with a 3-boat boathouse, and used my old bird-watching binoculars. And there it was. Tucked behind her boathouse, partially hidden by a tarp, was the second wind. She hadn't impounded it. She'd stolen it and parked it in her own backyard. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. She wasn't just a bully. She was a pirate flying the flag of the HOA covenant. This was more than a violation. This was theft. But confronting her directly would be a tactical error. She'd lie, her husband, the building inspector, would back her up, and it would be my word against the local establishment. A JAG lawyer learns that winning a war isn't about the first battle. It's about intelligence, strategy, and overwhelming force applied at the exact right moment. I needed to understand my enemy's entire empire before I laid siege to it, so I'd started digging deep. The first knowledge bomb dropped into my lap thanks to a dusty county ledger from 1998. HOAs have immense power, but that power is derived from their covenants, which are filed with the county. Any amendment to those covenants? Also filed. I was looking for the original rules about boat covers and unsightly vessels when I found it. A covenant amendment from 15 years ago, proposed and ratified by then-new board member Brenda Hopewell. It restricted boat length on private docks to 25 feet to preserve the rustic character of the lake. Her pontoon boat, the Rule Breaker, was a 40-foot floating McMansion. The hypocrisy was staggering, but it was also a vulnerability. She'd written a rule she herself flagrantly violated. It was a chink in her armor. I documented it, my fingers flying across the keyboard, adding it to the growing dossier. My second breakthrough came from an unexpected ally. Misery loves company. I'd made a post on the local community forum, a carefully worded question about HOA overreach. The responses flooded in, a torrent of quiet resentment from behind closed doors. An elderly widow, Mrs. Gable, whose son had built her a wheelchair ramp that was deemed non-compliant. She'd been fined daily until she couldn't afford it, and now she was a prisoner in her own home. The Millers, a young couple with twins, who'd painted their front door a cheerful sunflower yellow. Brenda had forced them to repaint it, HOA-approved drab greige at their own expense. And then there was old Mr. Peterson. His story made my blood run cold. He'd inherited a small lakeside cabin from his father. He'd fought Brenda for years over a shed he used for his fishing guide business. She'd eventually won, using an obscure covenant clause about commercial activity. She'd had the county condemn the shed, and then, 6 months later, her husband's development company had bought Mr. Peterson's property for a fraction of its value. He'd been forced to move into a cramped apartment in town. The smell of his story wasn't pine and lake water. It was the acrid stench of greed and coercion. This wasn't just about a boat. Brenda's pettiness was a weapon. A tool she used to harass, to financially strain, and to seize control of property she coveted. She was a parasite, dressed in khaki capris and wielding a clipboard. The most damning evidence arrived via an anonymous email from an account named Serenity Seeker. It was a scanned document, a permit application for the construction of Brenda's boathouse, the one currently housing the Rule Breaker. The application was approved by none other than Frank Hopewell, County Building Inspector. The listed dimensions for the boathouse were 20 by 30 feet. I'd seen her boathouse. It was easily 40 by 50. I'd measured it using a laser rangefinder from my property line. She'd built a structure nearly double the permitted size, and her husband had signed off on it. This was no longer just about HOA corruption. This was straight-up permit fraud, a criminal act, and it involved a county official. The stakes had just exploded from a neighborhood dispute to something that could bring down local government. I felt a familiar thrill, the same focus I'd felt before walking into a high-stakes court-martial. The puzzle pieces were locking into place. Arrogance, fraud, theft, a pattern of abuse of power. I decided to press my advantage. I requested a formal hearing with the full HOA board to appeal the impoundment of my boat. I needed to see the whites of their eyes. I needed to draw her out. The hearing was held in the same wood-paneled room where this had started. The air was thick with the smell of cheap coffee and cheaper perfume. The entire board was there, a council of yes-men and women who looked at Brenda with a mixture of fear and reverence. Brenda sat at the head of the table, a queen holding court. She didn't look smug. She looked bored. "Mr. Crocker," she began, not letting me speak first. "This is a simple matter of covenant compliance. Your vessel was unsightly and unseaworthy. It was removed. Pay the fines and the impound fees and you can collect it from the approved lot." "Which lot would that be, Brenda?" I asked, my voice calm. "Too calm," she blinked. "The county impound facility on Route 9. I called them," I said, leaning forward. The room got very quiet. "They don't impound boats. Never have." I let that hang in the air. I could see the other board members shift uncomfortably in their seats. "In fact, the only place I've seen my boat is tucked behind your boathouse. You know, the one that's twice the size of the permit your husband approved." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Brenda's face went from bored to stone-cold furious in a microsecond. Her eyes narrowed to slits. I had her. I'd called her bluff in front of her entire court. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You're trespassing, slanderizing. This hearing is over. The fine stands. The impound stands. And if you set 1 foot on my property, I will have you arrested." "On what charge?" I asked. "Recovering my stolen property?" She stood up, placing her palms on the table. "Get out!" I stood slowly, gathering my papers. I'd gotten what I came for. I'd seen the panic behind her eyes. I'd exposed her lie in front of her subordinates. The first crack in the foundation. I drove home, the adrenaline slowly ebbing. I'd won the skirmish, but I knew the war was coming. I'd just declared it openly. The retaliation was swift and brutal. It started the next morning. A certified letter from the county. My dock, the one my grandfather had built, was now deemed structurally unsound and a public hazard. It had to be demolished within 72 hours. The order was signed by Frank Hopewell. An hour later, a notice from the HOA. My house's roof was discolored and degrading property values. I needed to replace it with HOA-approved shingles, a $40,000 job, within 30 days. Then, the smear campaign began. Whispers at the local grocery store. People I'd been friendly with suddenly looked away. I was the difficult new guy, the troublemaker, the city slicker trying to change our way of life. Brenda was playing the small-town politics game, and she was a master. The pressure was immense. The financial strain of fighting these bogus orders would break most people. The social isolation was designed to make me give up and move. This was her playbook. She'd used it on Mr. Peterson. She was using it on me. I was in my office, staring at the wall of evidence, feeling the walls close in. The rain had started, a steady drumbeat on the roof. Judge pressed against my leg, sensing my despair. Maybe I should just pay the fine, get my boat, and sell this place. Let her win. The thought was ash in my mouth. My eyes drifted over the documents. The permit. The fraudulent permit. It was the key. It was a felony. But taking it to the local sheriff? His advisory council was Brenda's brother. It would be buried. There had to be another way. I started digging into who had jurisdiction over county building inspectors.
The state? The FBI?
And then I saw it. Tucked into the corner of the permit application was a small typed notation. Funds allocated from Dept of Ag and Commerce Rural Dev Grant, AG 774B, a federal grant. My breath caught in my throat. If Frank Hopewell had used federal grant money to approve his own wife's fraudulent building permit, that wasn't just local corruption. That was wire fraud, mail fraud, federal crimes. The knowledge bomb detonated in my mind with silent, devastating force. I hadn't just found a loophole. I'd found the nuclear option. I spent the next 4 hours compiling everything. The fake permit, the photos of the oversized boathouse, the financial records showing the grant disbursement, the testimonies from Mrs. Gable and the Millers showing a pattern of harassment to acquire property, and the pièce de résistance, time-stamped photos of my stolen boat, the second wind, sitting on Brenda's property. I wrote a cover letter, concise and factual, citing the specific federal statutes violated. I didn't write as an angry homeowner. I wrote as a former JAG Corps attorney submitting an evidence packet for prosecution. I addressed it to the nearest field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I printed it all. Every damning page. The stack of paper was 2 inches thick. The weight of it felt good in my hands. The smell of fresh toner was the smell of victory. I walked out into the rain to drive to the post office to send it certified mail. The gravel crunched under my boots. The storm was right overhead now, the sky a bruised purple. But as I reached my truck, I froze. Taped to my windshield was a single typewritten note. The paper was already slick with rain. Stop digging. You won't like what you find, or what finds you. It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. A cold dread, colder than the rain soaking through my shirt, trickled down my spine. This wasn't a notice from the HOA. This was a threat. She knew I was close. She knew I had the evidence. She wasn't playing by her own rules anymore. The queen of the HOA had just thrown away the rulebook. I looked down at the thick envelope in my hand, containing enough evidence to send the Hopewells to federal prison for a decade. Sending it was the point of no return. I looked back at the dark, quiet woods surrounding my house. Or what finds you? The rain poured down, soaking me to the skin. The choice was mine. Fold and live in peace without my boat, without my dignity, or fight and risk everything. I got in my truck, the envelope on the passenger seat. The wipers slashed across the windshield, clearing the rain for a second before it blurred again. I turned the key. The engine roared to life. I put the truck in drive, and I headed toward the post office. What would you have done in my place? Would you have mailed it? Comment below, because what happened next was something not even I, with all my training, could have ever predicted. The rain hadn't stopped for 2 days. It fell in a relentless gray curtain, turning my gravel driveway into a slurry of mud and pebbles, and the world outside my windows into a blurred, impressionist painting. The inside of my house, however, was a different kind of storm, a silent one. The only sounds were the ticking of the clock, the hum of my computer, and the low, anxious whine in Judge's throat as he stared at the door, as if expecting a battering ram to come through it. The threat on my windshield had changed the calculus entirely. This was no longer a legal dispute. It was a siege. Every creak of the old house, every snap of a twig outside sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I'd pulled my old field kit from the army, a tactical flashlight, a multi-tool, and kept it by the door. It felt ridiculous, paranoid, but the cold knot in my stomach insisted it was necessary. Brenda Hopewell wasn't just a homeowner with a clipboard. She was a cornered animal with connections to the very people who were supposed to protect us. I'd mailed the package to the FBI. There was no going back. All I could do now was wait and watch. The third morning dawned bleak and waterlogged. The rain had finally eased to a miserable drizzle. I was nursing a cup of coffee that tasted like acid, staring at the satellite image of Brenda's compound, when the first ripple of change disturbed the stagnant surface of Lake Serenity. It was the sound. Not the gentle putter of a fishing boat or the roar of a skidoo, but the deep, throaty thrum of a heavy-duty marine diesel engine. It was a sound that didn't belong. Judge's head shot up, his ears pivoting like radar dishes. I walked out onto my porch, the damp wood cool under my bare feet. The mist was thick, but through the gloom I could make out a shape on the water. A large, official-looking vessel with a blue strobe light flashing silently on its cabin. It was the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission boat. It idled directly in front of Brenda's dock. My first foolish thought was that they were there for me. That Brenda had fabricated some story about me polluting the lake or harassing wildlife. Then I saw the trucks. 2 black SUVs with government plates, their tires spraying rooster tails of muddy water, sped down the main road and turned sharply into Brenda's driveway, blocking the navigator. They didn't have sirens, but their purposeful, aggressive arrival was louder than any alarm. Men in dark windbreakers emblazoned with yellow letters I couldn't quite read emerged, moving with a coordinated, professional efficiency. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat matching the thrum of the diesel engine. This wasn't local sheriff stuff. This was something else. I grabbed my binoculars, my hands trembling slightly. I focused on the windbreakers. FBI, the package. They'd gotten the package, and they'd moved faster than I'd ever dared hope. Chaos erupted at the Hopewell compound. Frank Hopewell, a large, red-faced man I'd only seen in photos, was on the porch, waving his arms, his shouts lost to the distance, but his outrage clear in every jerky movement. An agent was calmly talking to him, holding up a piece of paper. A warrant, and then Brenda emerged. She was dressed not in her usual athleisure wear, but in a silk robe, her blonde hair disheveled. Even from 100 yards away, I could see the shock on her face. It was a beautiful, terrifying thing to witness. The mask of smug, untouchable authority had been ripped off, revealing the pale, stunned woman beneath. An agent approached her. She took a step back, shaking her head. She pointed a finger, jabbing it in the air, undoubtedly issuing a command they were there to follow. The agent didn't flinch. He just kept talking, his posture relaxed but immovable. This was the knowledge bomb that detonated silently in the misty morning air. Federal jurisdiction is a sledgehammer. When local corruption is so entrenched that it becomes the system itself, the only way to break it is from the outside. The FBI doesn't care about your brother on the sheriff's council. They don't care about your husband's county inspector badge. They care about violations of federal law. And wire fraud using federal grant money for personal gain. That's their bread and butter. They will come and they will not knock. I watched, mesmerized, as the scene unfolded like a silent film. The agents moved into the house. Others, accompanied by a woman in a WRC uniform, walked down to the dock. They were pointing at the rule breaker, then at the massive, clearly non-compliant boathouse. They were taking photographs, measurements, then the moment I'd been waiting for. 2 agents walked around the side of the boathouse. They pulled away the tarp. And there she was. The second wind, my father's boat. Seeing her there in the open felt like a physical release, a loosening of a wire that had been pulled taut around my chest for days. One of the agents nodded, spoke into his radio. This was it. The proof. The stolen property, sitting on the property of the woman who had authorized its theft. But the show wasn't over. The agents on the dock weren't just interested in the boathouse. They were now focused intently on the rule breaker itself. One of them, wearing latex gloves, was carefully examining the stern, specifically the registration numbers. He took more pictures. He called another agent over. A heated discussion seemed to take place. They boarded the pontoon boat and disappeared into the cabin. A new vehicle arrived. A flatbed truck, the kind used to haul away impounded cars. It backed carefully down Brenda's driveway. My mind was racing. What were they doing with the boat? The fraud was the boathouse permit, wasn't it? Why were they so focused on the rule breaker? And then I understood. The final, glorious knowledge bomb fell into place with perfect, devastating clarity. It wasn't just about the building. It was about the boat in the building. A vessel that large, that heavy, required a specific and very expensive marine title and registration with the state. The kind of registration that involves taxes, fees, and in-depth inspections. The kind a person who was already committing permit fraud would likely also skip. The rule breaker wasn't just evidence. It was the scene of another crime. The agents emerged from the cabin. The one in charge gave a sharp nod. Another agent approached Brenda, who was now standing handcuffed on her own perfectly manicured lawn, her silk robe soaked through and clinging to her. He spoke to her. Even from my porch, I saw her shoulders slump. She shook her head, then finally she nodded, a gesture of utter defeat. The signal was given. The agents on the dock began the meticulous process of securing the rule breaker to be hauled out. They weren't gentle. They treated it like the piece of evidence it was. I watched, my breath fogging in the cool, damp air, as the luxury pontoon boat, the symbol of Brenda's untouchable reign, was winched onto the flatbed truck. The FBI was taking her boat. The irony was so perfect, so poetically just, that a laugh burst out of me, a raw, startled sound that made Judge jump. They'd taken my father's humble whaler on a bogus charge. Now, the federal government was taking her floating palace on very, very real ones. The trucks left first, carrying a shell-shocked Frank and Brenda Hopewell into a justice system that wouldn't be swayed by county connections. The flatbed followed, the rule breaker looking absurd and diminished lashed to its trailer. Finally, the wildlife boat powered up its diesel and slid away through the mist, its silent blue strobe fading into the gray. The silence that returned to Lake Serenity was different. It wasn't the silence of oppression or fear. It was the quiet after a storm. The air itself seemed cleaner, lighter, scented with wet pine and fresh, unclaimed possibility. I didn't wait for permission. I walked down to my dock, the weathered planks firm and familiar under my feet. Judge bounded ahead of me, his tail wagging, the anxiety of the last few days forgotten. I untied my little John boat, the backup, and started the small outboard. I motored the short distance to Brenda's dock, now just a crime scene waiting to be processed. 2 agents were still there, placing evidence tags. One looked up as I approached. "Can I help you, sir?" "That's my boat," I said, pointing to the second wind. My voice was steady. "The one she stole." The agent glanced at his clipboard, then back at me. "You Crocker?" "I am," he gave a short nod. "Take it. We've got all the photos we need. Sorry for the inconvenience." Inconvenience. It was the understatement of the century, but from him, it sounded like an apology from the universe itself. I tied up the John boat and stepped onto the hated soil of Brenda's property for the first and last time. I walked to the second wind. She was fine. A little dirty, but unharmed. I ran my hand along her gunnel, the sun-bleached teak smooth and warm. I could feel the eyes of the agents on me, but I didn't care. This was a reunion. I climbed in, settled behind the wheel, and turned the key. The old Evinrude coughed once, then roared to life, its familiar smoky smell a sweet perfume of victory. I backed her out, turned her toward home, and opened the throttle. The wind whipped my hair, and Judge barked excitedly from the John boat I was towing behind me. I felt the tension of the last week, the fury, the sleepless nights, the paranoia, wash away in the wake of the second wind. We sailed past the empty Hopewell dock, past the boathouse that was now just a monument to greed, and back to our own little slice of the lake. The news spread through the community like wildfire. By that evening, my phone was blowing up. Not with suspicion or avoidance, but with gratitude. Mrs. Gable called, her voice trembling with emotion, asking if this meant she could finally build her ramp. The Millers texted a photo of a paint can labeled Sunflower Supreme with a grinning emoji. Ray from Mountain Marine drove over with a six-pack of beer, and we sat on my dock not saying much, just listening to the water lap against the posts. The empire of Brenda Hopewell had crumbled not with a whisper, but with the diesel roar of federal authority. The scandal was exposed. The headlines in the coming days would be brutal for her. The illegal acts were laid bare. The justice was for once perfect and swift. A week later, a formal letter arrived from the interim HOA board. All fines against me were rescinded. My dock was officially recognized as grandfathered and approved. A community-wide vote was scheduled to discuss dissolving the HOA's more punitive powers entirely. I sat on my dock that evening. The second wind tied securely beside me, wearing her old, comfortable blue tarp without a single complaint. The sky was ablaze with oranges and purples, reflecting off the perfectly serene water. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the scent of lake water, grilling burgers, and freedom. They'd tried to take my boat. They'd tried to take my peace. But they'd forgotten a fundamental truth my father taught me, a truth reinforced in military courtrooms and small-town showdowns. Bullies only have the power you give them. Stand your ground. Know the rules better than they do. And sometimes, just sometimes, you get to watch as the universe delivers a payoff more satisfying than anything you could have ever planned. The fight was over. The lake was finally truly serene. But her story, it's a warning. And it's not over yet. Your story could be next. If you've ever been pushed around by someone who thought they were above the rules, comment your horror story below. Let's see how many of us there are. Let's make sure no one has to fight this fight alone again. And if you believe in this kind of justice, hit subscribe. Because where there's one corrupt HOA, there's another. And together we can hold them all accountable.